in progress. Should I click on the right one, or does it all go to pieces again? Okay, so I think I've introduced myself, basically anyway. Just a tiny bit more about, I guess, my background. I've sort of told you where I was born and raised. I have a background as a lawyer initially. Don't hold that against me. For a few years. I know there's one or two lawyers in the room. Practiced law, and then but I couldn't stop studying history, so I did an MA, and I recently completed a PhD, which was a bit of a journey, but it's actually done now, so it probably hasn't quite sunk in yet, actually. But and then essentially I moved into treaty sector work in Wellington. So in 2011, moved to Wellington with the whānau. I'm married to Hannah. We have 4 children. And I worked for the Waitangi Tribunal for a year. I've sort of done the rounds, and I went to the Office of Treaty Settlements for about 3 years, which is probably almost my best job that I've had. Sorry, I shouldn't be getting emotional at this point. It's not a good start. And then after that, just to actually keep us going, well, not to keep us going, because I've enjoyed this work too. I've worked as a historical consultant for the Crown Law Office on treaty Waitangi Tribunal proceedings, essentially. So that's been my life for the last 10 years or so. And obviously I've done the academic study as well, and been involved with the trusts since its beginning in 2005. Okay, so these workshops, this is actually the first time I've presented this material in this exact format, so which is pretty cool. I hope you think it's cool too. So I'm looking forward to it, but also keen for sort of feedback afterwards about how it's gone, and things that I guess could be improved or whatever. So what I'm planning to do is get through these 4 kind of modules, as I'm calling them: the treaty in its context, New Zealand missions history in its context, the New Zealand Wars, and then jumping kind of 100 years, but with a linking narrative to the treaty settlements process, or the modern process since the 1970s. So I was thinking of a metaphor. Probably I'm going to take it too far, but if this history could be sort of contained in Wellington Harbour, then we're doing like a quick shoot over sort of one of the main parts of it. But occasionally, I think we are going to pause, and we're going to maybe dive down a bit and hopefully pull up a few nuggets, maybe a few poa or a crayfish or something, and sort of think about what this all means. I have some video segments, so you don't have to listen to me the whole time, including from the eminent Jamie Bellich. He's now at Oxford. So, treaty in its context. Now I'm starting with a quote from a German philosopher, so Tanya's going to be happy with me. This is something I came across, in a sense it's a little bit esoteric, but I've been reading through his notebooks recently, and I really like this as a way to sort of make us think about how we approach this material, really. So there really are cases where someone has the sense of what he wants to say much more clearly in his mind than he can express in words. Hopefully that's not me in this workshop. This happens to me very often. It is as though one had a dream image quite clearly before one's mind's eye, but could not describe it to someone else so as to let him see it too. As a matter of fact, for the writer, as Wittgenstein, it is often as though the image stays there behind the words, so that they seem to describe it to me. as a matter of fact, it is often as though the image stays there behind the words that they seem to describe it to me. Now, I came across something I was reading last night. That's what I do for fun, is read Macaulay's History of England. He is quite striking, actually. He's talking about the the 17th century, late 17th century in England, and is describing London at the time, which is actually an amazing description. And he's comparing it with sort of the 1840s. So it's quite remarkable the way he describes those changes. But he's saying in that time, there weren't many, the houses didn't really have numbers. And the reason for that, like address numbers on the gates, whatever, because the people delivering parcels and the coachmen and things couldn't actually read, a lot of them. So, and instead what they had was, and now I sort of understand where all these old English pubs get their names. They had, they'd have signs of various kinds, like, the blue bear or the golden fleece, or, things like this. So you'd be able to tell the coachman or the errand boy, deliver it to the golden fleece, So when we actually think about communication and how people communicate, I think we need to realize that we're actually probably the most educated, society or world that's ever existed, but still, in some ways that makes us a little bit I think we often assume too much in terms of interpreting past societies and how they saw things. So I'm using this quotation, I'm back to Wittgenstein, to point to three interrelated things. So the challenge of communication, especially across cultures, and then, as I've said, especially across time. So history is a foreign country. If communication is difficult, what about understanding, the values, the frames of reference, the language, even of past times? And history is about interpretation, not facts. There you go. So the really important questions, including why something happened or what something meant, require interpretation of language and of actions that may be quite foreign to us. I was thinking, what's a good illustration of this? And the best thing I could come up with was to ask you a factual question. Even factual questions are often hard to answer. So when was the Treaty of Waitangi signed? Who's got an answer for that? Yep. Yep, that's a brilliant answer. That's probably what most people would give. So yeah, exactly. So yes, it was signed then, but it was actually discussed the day before, primarily, and into the night. And then it was signed over subsequent months at very many different places. So even factual questions are not actually always easy to answer. So the nature of this workshop, what is it? It's essentially an exercise in historical narration and explanation, primarily. So there'll be some little narrative segments, i.e. on such and such a date, something happened. Some narrative summaries, key facts and figures, and then some sort of interpretation sections which I guess are framed by the literature around various issues. Okay, so this is an interpretation piece just to get us going, I suppose. How has the treaty been understood through time? And I'm not going to sort of really dwell on this, but just to give you a little snapshot. So Henry Williams and Governor Fitzroy, for example, referred to the treaty as a Magna Carta, which I would explain as a document of constitutional significance, a document that protected rights. We could go into a whole heap of detail on that, but not time today. A device. Now this is a bit of a repellent description, but a device to amuse savages. So this was the New Zealand company who didn't really like the treaty because it was essentially a sort of a crown thing, and they basically wanted to be free of crown control. And they also had lots of ideas around, I guess, you know, how Western states should or could relate to Indigenous tribes or native tribes and things like that. You may have heard of the doctrine of discovery, and there's a little bit of that wrapped up in that. So a covenant or a sacred agreement, like a biblical covenant. Honi Heke, in fact, referred to the treaty at the discussion on the 5th of February 1840, where he likened the treaty to the New Testament, he said, recently translated, or, you know, that has recently come into being at Paihia. Quite what he meant by that is interesting, but of course, you know, the Māori name for the New Testament was He Kawanata Ho, a new covenant, or a new, you know, testament, revelation. So it's interesting that he made that connection, and Claudia Orange has sort of added to that way of sort of understanding the treaty. So there you go. That's three quite distinct ways that the treaty has been understood. I should say I'm happy to take sort of little questions of clarification along the way if I'm not really making sense. But in terms of the substantive discussion, I prefer to sort of leave that till the end, so that we have time for good discussion at the end. But if there's something that some language that I'm not using that's unclear, just let me know. So okay, a little bit of narrative before the treaty. And this workshop was not necessarily assuming any particular knowledge. So I'm sorry if this, I'm not sorry, but just acknowledging that this is not news to many of you. So before the treaty, there was some contacts between Māori chiefs and governors of New South Wales and Norfolk Island, and with European sailors and whalers. Did I say before 1814? That's what I meant to say. In 1814, Marsden and the missionaries arrived, Samuel Marsden from Parramatta, New South Wales. Marsden conducts the first Christian service on New Zealand soil, to which Māori respond with a haka of 300 to 400 warriors, and I'll touch on that more in the second module today. 1820, the chiefs Hongi and Waikato travel with missionary Thomas Kendall to England, and that's depicted in this lovely painting here, where they meet King George. It's said that on the way back through Sydney, Hongi exchanged all the presents he got from the king, 4 muskets, apart from a suit of armour, which I think some accounts suggest he actually wore in battle, or tried to, in the New Zealand Wars. Sorry, not New Zealand Wars. Well, arguably they're part of the New Zealand Wars, the Musket Wars, 1820s and 30s. And with those muskets, he conducted wars of Utu or plunder against southern iwi, some that he had actual vendettas against because of things that had happened in the past with his near relatives. So 1833, James Busby is appointed British resident in New Zealand in an effort to establish official relations between the British government and New Zealand, and to control the conduct of lawless British subjects, as they were called, and most of them ships' crews and some few settlers. In 1834, chiefs at Waitangi chose the first New Zealand flag to enable New Zealand ships to trade legally overseas. That was the reason for the adoption of the flag. It's kind of identified as the Confederation flag, which you'll see flying, especially up at Waitangi, over commemorations and many other places. In 1835, chiefs at Waitangi adopted a declaration of independence of their country, which Britain recognised, at least in part it recognised it. Now actually that banner down there is actually a copy of the original declaration document, and there's a little bit more detail about the declaration there. So that's actually how the original document looked. It was signed by mostly northern chiefs, and in the next few years, a few other rangatira, including a couple of prominent ones from further south, including the first Māori king, which is really interesting. So why the treaty? That is what led to the decision of the British government to intervene. A number of reasons here. In the first place, or maybe not in the first place, this is in no necessary order, the British government feared French efforts to colonise New Zealand. Secondly, land speculators in New Zealand and New South Wales were buying up land from chiefs, or were purporting to do so. Thirdly, missionaries and their United Kingdom parent societies advocated for the British government to prevent uncontrolled colonisation that would harm Indigenous populations. So that was the Aborigines report in 1937, which is on our website if you want to read it. British settlement was coming. In some ways, probably almost the most important reason at the time. So the first New Zealand company ships arrived in Wellington in 1939, so before Hobson arrived in the country, and acquired the whole of the Wellington area and the Port Nicholson deed. Company agents also purported to have acquired millions of acres in the North Island. Most of those purchases were disallowed later by the land commissions in the 1840s, though not the Wellington deed, which was basically affirmed, and reserves in various parts were set aside for Māori, including the place where I live, Waitangi, was a 100-acre reserve, and that has its own story. Yep. It should have. I can't give a specific answer. I mean, yeah, the idea was, yes, the reserves were kind of meant to be those tenths reserves, as in a tenth of all of the land that was purchased in the company scheme was to be set aside. I haven't run my figures on what the percentages look like in Wellington, but there were some reasonable size reserves set aside, like 100 acres at Waiwhetu, there's some in Taita. There were some in the city here, I think at Aotearoa, because there was a pass site, Aotearoa Valley. So yeah, anyway, that's its whole own story. Got some further reading there in the notes about the background to the British moving to intervene, so to speak. So the treaty at Waitangi and many other places. In 1839, Captain William Hobson was sent by British government to negotiate with Māori the right to establish British sovereignty and civil government in New Zealand, or portions of it. And I think it's actually quite important to recognise that initially it wasn't necessarily envisaged that the British would try and acquire the whole of the country, that they would just focus on enclaves where there were settlements and so on. In the end, Hobson, I think, said we need to take control of the whole lot for reasons that I'll sort of elaborate on a bit more, but for those reasons partly that I raised before. So in late January 1840, Hobson arrived in the Bay of Islands, and about a week later, he'd negotiated the treaty at Waitangi with rangatira. And this was followed by signing around the country. So there were 9 treaty sheets, 8 were in Te Reo, and 1 was in English. The English one was signed by 40 rangatira at Fort Waikato, close to where I was brought up. And 500 chiefs signed the treaty, including around a dozen women in that number, it is believed. Some scholars have tracked all the signatories, identified them to the extent you can. Amazingly, I think a lot of them have been identified, and I've got links to those to some web pages where you can actually trace through all of the signatories. These are all the places and the numbers of people who signed in those places. That's what the numbers are. So this was a process of months rather than weeks as well. What did the treaty say? Now, this is a summary. Obviously, the texts are on our website if you want to read them in full. In Article 1, Māori cede or give up sovereignty in the English text, or kāwanatanga, government in the Māori text. In Article 2, the Queen Victoria promises to protect ownership in the English text, or rangatira, tino rangatiratanga, chieftainship in the Māori text of lands, estates, forests and fisheries, that's the English text. The Māori text has whenua, kāinga, or villages, taonga, treasured possessions. And the Crown has preemption over land acquisitions, meaning, to simplify it, that the Crown has control over all land dealings, essentially, with Māori. So Māori have to deal with the Crown. They can't deal with a settler after 1840. Article 3, Queen Victoria promises to grant Māori the rights and privileges of British subjects. Okay, I hesitated doing this bit because this could probably be a whole workshop, but it would be remiss of me not to touch on it. So since the 70s, there's been a lot of critique of the treaty and whether the translation of it was adequate.
Sam, just a quick question.
Yeah.
You've not mentioned the verbal Article 4?
Yes, true. Okay, I'll explain that briefly now. So there was an oral, as they called it, the oral article, the verbal article, which was basically essentially a guarantee, because it arose in the Waitangi debates on the 5th of February 1840, I think from the Roman Catholic bishop, Pompellier, saying, are all the faiths, are all the customs going to be protected by the Crown? And Hobson said, oh, well, yeah, of course. So essentially it's a guarantee of religious freedom, I suppose, including a reference to Māori belief in there, but it refers to the faiths like Catholic, Anglican, Wesleyan, etc., as it was recorded, but it's certainly not in the signed treaty. Yeah. So the main critique, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's a whole discussion in itself, but the main critique is that the translation from the English draft into the Māori did not adequately convey the cession of sovereignty to the Crown. So there are various streams of lines of thought on this, and actually historians don't agree, and I'm one of those historians. So, and I have my own take, which I will sort of elaborate on slightly. But so people say that sovereignty could have been expressed by the word mana, or the word kingitanga. They were used in the Declaration of Independence in 1835 to express the concept of all sovereign power and authority. And now, so what about this? Mana, of course, is a word that actually is not a very simple word to interpret or explain, but essentially it denoted the innate authority of chiefs derived from whakapapa and also proven leadership. So it was both inherited and earned in a sense. In a sense, you could say it could have denoted an abstract idea of authority or sovereignty. But because of this sort of Māori meaning, some historians say, I guess I'm one of them, it would be difficult to use because would Māori give up their mana in that sense? Another reason why Williams decided not to use it is because the British, and when I say the British, I mean the translators, Henry Williams, and also the, I think Hobson and co, they saw chiefly rights as in a sense protected by the treaty, except where inconsistent with Christian morality. And I'll elaborate on that point in a minute. Kingitanga is kingship. This was certainly a possible choice to translate sovereignty. There were discussions about native kingships before the treaty. Samuel Marsden, in fact, tried to get chiefs to, Hongi Hika being one, to consider establishing a kingdom, which would create sort of an overarching framework for government, in New Zealand, a native one. But that didn't happen. I think Hongi said to him, they only listen to me in warfare, and they don't listen to me else otherwise. They probably did listen to him at other times too, actually. But so this was certainly possible. Could have been used. Possible gender issue with Queen Victoria. But in a sense, what I say on this is the Queen was not ruling directly here. She was ruling through her governor. I'll come back to that. So then the rangatiratanga, chiefly authority or independence. This can mean a number of things. In the prayer book, in the Bible, it was used to translate the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God, or the rule of God, perhaps. So that even that word in itself had a range of meanings. Williams decided to use that for the guarantee to Māori in Article 2 that rangatiratanga of lands, villages, etc., taonga would be protected. But it was probably an option for Article 1. What did he actually do? Him and his son Edward, he was 21 at the time. They used the word government, governorship, which was kawana, governor. The tangas, all of the qualities pertaining to the governor. So this was used in lots of interesting ways in scripture for the governorship of God, actually, as well. God's referred to as in one of the prayers, which was said almost every day, as the governor of princes, Te kawana o ngā pireniha. So what I say about this is that kawanatanga was the form and substance of sovereignty in British political language and in constitutional arrangements, also in imperial institutions. This is how the British ruled the empire, right, through governors. I think what it meant was a civil authority to ensure law and order at a national level, but that it would allow for the protection of local, tribal, and chiefly rights. That's what I think it meant to someone like Williams. I can take more questions on that later. What did the treaty mean to the parties? So very briefly, in terms of the oral records of negotiations, and we actually have very few of those, some from Waitangi because of Colenso, and Colenso's an interesting observer, and some from the northern signings. We have almost nothing substantive from all of the southern signings, so we don't know what was discussed for the most part. I mean, there's a few little reports of, from the Crown officials and the missionaries who took the texts around. At Waitangi, and at Hokianga, there were two stances, I suppose. There were chiefs that said, we don't want anyone ruling over us. we prefer to remain as we are. And then there were the others that said we can't go back. We need the British government's protection from other foreign powers, from settler lawlessness, and perhaps, this is a bit more of an inference in terms of those debates, from other tribes as well. But when we're considering what Māori understood, you know, a lot of tribes in the interior didn't actually sign the treaty for a start. The treaty never actually got there. And all of those southern iwi had limited contact with Europeans and with European ideas and institutions by 1840. So this meant that there would have been a range of understandings anyway of what this document meant and its implications. So very quickly, what did the treaty mean to Māori? This is a list of a range of things that it meant. For the northern iwi, it reaffirmed an alliance established between the northern chiefs and the British monarch from Hongihika onwards, 1820, when he visited. Secondly, it was a decision to ally with Britain rather than France. Reaffirmed tribal and chiefly control of lands and resources. The British governor would control British traders and settlers. The British governor would protect tribes from their traditional foes. The British governor would create conditions for peace, for civil peace and trade. Trade and the trade in land, the trade in goods and the trade in land were visible issues in the debates that we have records of. What did the treaty mean to the British? In simple terms, it gave the Kawanatanga the right to establish a civil government, to preserve the peace, control British settlement, and regulate the trade in land, as I've noted earlier, you know, about the Wellington situation. Now, how the governor's authority would relate to chiefly authority and tribal custom remain to be worked out. Hobson's instructions from England, he had clear instructions to protect tribal custom, in fact, as long as it wasn't inconsistent, as a lovely English quote, the universal maxims of humanity and morals, which meant things like human sacrifice and cannibalism, and by inference at least, tribal warfare. So Hobson was to concern himself with those things, but by and large, he was to let chiefs be chiefs and tribes be tribes. And I want to note here, in terms of a global perspective on this, that British imperial practice tolerated, sometimes actively fostered, a range of forms of local indigenous authority and custom. So the continuance of chiefly authority as such was not an issue, I believe. Okay, we're actually almost at the end of my talking now for this one. Very quickly, this is my last slide, and then I've got a video segment, and then we can have more of a discussion. So a few more different answers about how the treaty's been understood. The lands case, 1987, talked about the treaty as a partnership, and that's become a very almost sort of predominant discourse in that kind of political discourse, civil service discourse, and the wider society about the treaty. Important to recognise that, to my knowledge, there are only really dates from the 1980s. We can almost gloss over the next one. Historical document, no particular relevance today. The Crown position, the orthodox position historically was that it allowed Britain to add New Zealand to its empire. The idea of consent from Māori was a real thing from a humanitarian point of view, not necessarily from a New Zealand company point of view, because they just thought, oh, we don't have to deal with, you know, these people. But that was, I guess, how it was viewed. Today, I think what the Crown says is that it's a document that imposes moral and political obligations on the Crown to honour so the honour of the Crown. Of course, it's been introduced into lots of legislation as well, which gives it sort of legal weight, but that's a kind of slightly separate discussion. And then lastly, a Māori view, particularly a Ngāpuhi view, a document that reaffirmed Māori tino rangatira full chieftainship, or to use the way it's often stated these days, sovereignty, as declared in He Whakaputanga, Reign 35. So there you go. A lot of different ways of understanding. We're going to, unless there are any quick questions or clarification, I'm just going to play a short segment. We started way behind time, so we kind of, not way behind time, but we started behind time. We're going to have to make up a bit of ground, but that's right. We'll cut our cloth a bit later on. Mike King, the comedian, not Michael King, the historian, did a great series in 2009. This is probably almost the best thing I think that's been done in recent times in terms of giving people an understanding of the treaty and kind of interfacing with descendants of signatories and things. Pretty sure almost all of it is on YouTube, but there's some excerpts on New Zealand On Screen website, and that is what I'm going to go to in a minute. Just give me a moment.